What if the ritual you thought was just an urban legend was real? When Nathan agrees to test a mysterious 13th floor ritual, he unknowingly awakens something far older than any cult or curse, a gate built on generations of blood. As he dives deeper, the truth unfolds. His family was never cursed. They were chosen. And now, the last heir must decide whether to break the chain or be consumed like those before him. Some rituals don't seek participants. They seek successors. It started at exactly 3:33 a.m. My phone lit up in the darkness, breaking the dead silence of my small studio apartment. No calls, no messages, just a single notification. You have been selected. I sat up, blinking away the haze of uneasy sleep. The notification remained on the screen, cold white letters against the black background. For a second I thought it was some kind of spam, another phishing attempt, but then I noticed the sender, simply labeled M. My stomach twisted. I hadn't seen that username in over a decade. For years I had buried the obsession, the hours spent scouring obscure forums, late-night rabbit holes about rituals, urban legends, and forbidden challenges. Most of it was harmless creepypasta, campfire stories for the digital age. But the 13th floor ritual had always been different. It was the last thing my brother Daniel read before he vanished 15 years ago. I stared at the screen. The message contained a link, one I had seen once before, right before the old thread was scrubbed from existence. Against every rational thought screaming inside me, I tapped it. The page loaded instantly, like it had been waiting for me all these years. The 13th floor ritual, strict adherence required. Failure may result in permanent consequences. Find a building with at least 13 floors. Begin the ritual alone, precisely 1 hour after midnight. Ride the elevator, stopping at each floor in ascending order, never stepping out. At the 13th floor, exit and leave behind an item of great personal value. Return to the elevator and descend. If the elevator ascends instead, disrupt immediately by selecting any other floor. Leave the building without looking back. Only one may perform the ritual. Only one may see beyond. I read the instructions again, even though I had memorized them long ago. My breath was shallow, my pulse rising in my ears. There was a part of me that had always wanted to try it, to find out what Daniel saw that night, what took him from me. And now, it was as if the ritual had come looking for me. I needed someone to ground me, someone I trusted. Without thinking twice, I called Steve. Steve had been my only constant, the one who stayed when everyone else moved on. When police reports went cold, when my family disintegrated after Daniel's disappearance, we'd shared an unhealthy fascination for horror lore back in high school, spending nights daring each other to explore abandoned buildings, chasing ghost stories with nothing but flashlights and shaky phone cameras. He answered on the second ring. "Jesus, Nate, it's 3:30 in the goddamn morning. I need you," I said quietly. My voice trembled despite my best effort. "It's back." There was silence on the other end for a beat. Then his tone shifted, low and cautious. "The ritual?" I nodded, forgetting he couldn't see me. "The 13th floor, the original thread, someone just sent it to me. It's active again." Steve exhaled sharply. "I thought we agreed to let that shit die years ago." "I can't, Steve," I whispered. "Not after Daniel. Not after everything." Another pause. I could hear him weighing it, as he always did. Rational, careful, but he also understood me better than anyone. "Where?" he finally asked. "I've been looking," I said. "There's one place. Markham Tower, downtown, 18 floors. The top 5 have been sealed since 2007. That's the building where..." He trailed off. "Yeah?" I said, my voice hollow. "The suicides, the mass disappearance." Steve cursed under his breath. "You really think it's connected?" "I don't know." My fingers clenched into fists. "But I have to find out." He was quiet again. Then, "All right, but we're not doing this alone. We go together. You do your part. I'll shadow you on the stairs at each floor, like backup, just like old times." Relief mixed with dread in my chest. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he muttered. "I'll meet you at 11 tonight." The wind howled like a living thing as we parked several blocks away that night. Careful not to draw attention, Markham Tower loomed ahead, its skeletal frame cutting into the starless sky like a forgotten tombstone. The building used to house a dozen corporations, banks, law firms, even some state offices. But after 2007, after the scandal, the mass incident that no one would officially explain, its tenants fled. The lower floors still functioned as a small insurance agency during the day, but the upper levels had been sealed for years. But tonight, no lights burned in any windows. The tower stood dead and silent. We approached carefully. The front doors, surprisingly, weren't locked. The lobby was exactly as I imagined, trapped in another decade. Faded carpet, dead potted plants, tarnished brass fixtures once meant to evoke Art Deco grandeur, now dulled by years of neglect. At the far end stood the elevators, 3 gleaming silver doors, curiously modern, almost out of place in the ruin. "Looks like they upgraded the elevator system at some point," Steve whispered, scanning for cameras. "Still feel like backing out?" I shook my head, forcing steady breaths. "The rules say only one can ride. I need you on the stairs, just like we planned." Steve gave me a tight nod, though his eyes betrayed his own fear. A noon hour after midnight. We stick to the schedule. As the clock hit 1:00 a.m., I stepped into the elevator alone. The doors slid shut with a soft sigh, leaving behind the world I knew. The elevator hummed softly as it began its ascent, the quiet whirring of the cables the only sound filling the small, sterile box. My reflection stared back at me from the polished steel walls, pale, wide-eyed, pretending to be braver than I was. I pressed the button for the first floor, as the ritual demanded. The elevator jolted ever so slightly, then smoothly slid up. As I ascended, a chill settled into my spine. I wasn't sure if it was the cold or the gnawing realization of where I was, what I was doing. Every creak of the cables felt amplified, like strained whispers echoing through the shaft. If you could be a little more specific. Every creak of the cables felt amplified, like strained whispers echoing through the shaft at the first floor. The doors opened to an empty hallway bathed in dim emergency lighting. Everything seemed ordinary, normal even. I stared for a moment, half expecting something to step out from the darkness, but there was nothing. Steve had reached the staircase landing and was waiting behind the glass security door, raising a hand in silent acknowledgement before quickly ducking out of view to keep to the rules. The doors closed and I pressed for the second floor. We repeated the process, floor after floor. With each stop, Steve was there on the stairwell landing, always keeping his distance, following the strict limitations we both knew we couldn't break. By the 6th floor, the atmosphere had shifted. The air grew heavier. The dull buzz of the elevator's fluorescent lighting occasionally flickered. There was a faint, static hiss coming from somewhere above, subtle enough to dismiss at first, but impossible to ignore after a while. The elevator's mirror-like panels now seemed slightly warped. My reflection trembled for a moment before stabilizing. I blinked hard, chalking it up to nerves and lack of sleep. But deep down, I felt something watching me. Not just my reflection, but something beyond the glass, behind my image, like a predator studying its prey from an invisible perch. The 7th floor opened to reveal something different. The hallway here was darker than before, colder too. A draft swept through the opening like a breath escaping an ancient lung. The walls bore faint scratch marks, almost like claw grooves in the old plaster. Steve was there again, on the stairs. But this time his expression had changed. His face was tight with concern, his eyes darting nervously behind me, as if he too sensed an unspoken presence lingering nearby. "You okay?" he mouthed. I gave him a small nod, though my stomach was in knots. The doors slid closed. At the 8th and 9th floors, faint sounds began to bleed through the speaker system. Broken whispers that didn't belong to any radio frequency or intercom feed. It was like several voices speaking at once, overlapping and twisting around each other in a language I couldn't recognize. My ears rang with pressure and I pressed my palms flat against them, trying to drown it out, but the elevator wouldn't stop. It was following the order I had input, regardless of what was happening inside. When the doors parted on the 10th floor, the lights above flickered violently. For a brief second, I thought I saw a shadow slip across the hallway. Something unnaturally tall and thin, gliding along the edge of my vision. Steve wasn't at the landing this time. My heart dropped. I leaned out cautiously, trying to spot him through the stairwell window, but saw nothing. No movement, no signal, only the emptiness of the stairwell spiraling into darkness above and below. Panic swirled in my chest. I hit the button for the 11th floor anyway. The elevator doors sealed shut, swallowing me into the sterile box again. The ascent continued, but this time it felt slower, as though the cables were dragging themselves against the will of gravity. The humming of the motor grew strained, almost groaning. The doors peeled open for the 11th floor. No Steve. The hallway was coated in dust, papers scattered like remnants of an abandoned office, frozen in time. I glanced to my left, then right. Empty. The air was cold, sharp like ice water slicing into my throat with every breath. My skin prickled, as if thousands of tiny invisible insects crawled across my arms. I pressed for the 12th floor with shaking hands. The doors closed again, but my reflection didn't follow immediately. For half a second after the doors sealed, my mirrored image remained fixed in place before it too blinked out, delayed, like a video feed buffering behind reality. A loud mechanical clunk echoed from the shaft as the elevator rose toward the 12th floor. This time, I couldn't stop myself from whispering under my breath, "Steve, where the hell are you?" The doors opened. The 12th floor was almost completely dark now. Emergency lights pulsed faintly down the long corridor, but they cast more shadows than illumination. Everything felt too still, too deliberate, as though the entire floor was holding its breath. "Steve?" I called out softly. No answer. Instead, faint footsteps echoed somewhere distant, shuffling against the cracked tile floor. Not running, not stomping, just pacing, waiting. I strained my ears, trying to follow the sound, but it seemed to circle me, shifting locations every few seconds, like a predator stalking unseen from behind thin walls. Then came the whisper, low, breathy, unmistakable. "Nathan." My knees nearly buckled. It wasn't Steve's voice. It was something trying to sound like him. I slammed my thumb against the button for the 13th floor. The elevator groaned with protest but obeyed. The ascent felt eternal. By the time the doors slid open again, the air inside the elevator was freezing. My breath came out in pale clouds, fogging the metal walls briefly before dissipating. The 13th floor was nothing like the others. There was no familiar hallway, no doors, no emergency lights. Just a long, endless corridor, vanishing into blackness. The floor covered in what looked like old, threadbare carpet from another century. Stale, sour air filled my lungs. And ahead, far ahead, silhouettes shifted, unmoving, tall, impossible. They were waiting for me. Behind me, the elevator doors whispered shut. The ritual had begun its second stage. The cold pressed against my chest as I stepped forward. My flashlight flickered weakly in my trembling hand, its narrow beam swallowed almost instantly by the darkness ahead. The corridor was impossibly long. The air itself seemed thicker, heavier, as if every breath I drew was being filtered through something ancient. I paused, my ears straining for any sign of Steve. Silence met me like a wall. No footsteps, no breathing, no shuffling. Only the faint buzz of the flickering overhead lights behind me, though even they seemed unsure of their own existence now. I turned briefly, half expecting the elevator doors to still be open behind me, offering an escape. They weren't. The doors had vanished completely. Where once was a steel portal back to safety, now stood only a blank, smooth wall that looked as though it had always been there. My chest tightened. My mouth went dry. The ritual had shifted. Somehow it had moved past the rules I thought I understood. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I forced myself forward, one cautious step at a time. The deeper I walked, the more distorted everything became. The walls rippled faintly, as though the very structure of this place was breathing alongside me. Every few feet I passed old wooden doors, each one slightly ajar, leading into rooms shrouded in utter blackness. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was absence itself. A kind of void that seemed to swallow sound, sight, and sanity. Something whispered inside my head as I moved. Quiet, indistinct words, like a foreign language spoken behind thin glass. It wasn't loud enough to fully hear, but it wasn't silent enough to ignore. Every few steps, I'd catch flashes of movement from the corners of my eyes. Thin, elongated shadows, flickering across the threshold of those open doorways, retreating into the dark before I could focus, like they were waiting, observing. I kept my flashlight steady, though my hand shook violently. After what felt like forever, I stumbled upon something lying in the middle of the hallway. A small, dust-covered object glinting under my beam. I crouched carefully, eyes darting to the endless black surrounding me, and reached out. It was Steve's flashlight. Cold dread prickled down my spine. His flashlight still worked, but there was no sign of him. No blood, no struggle, just abandonment. "Steve?" I called out softly, my voice cracking. No reply, only the distant creaking of old pipes above, groaning like dying animals. I stood up, clutching his flashlight tight in my free hand. Two beams now pierced the gloom, but they offered no real comfort. If anything, the twin cones of light only made the surrounding shadows feel denser, pressing closer. The corridor curved ahead, bending unnaturally to the left like a distorted spinal cord. I followed, unable to turn back. Where would I even turn back to? The walls themselves seemed to shift behind me, removing any path I might retrace. Around the bend, I froze. They stood there, far ahead. Figures. At first I thought my mind was breaking, creating shapes from the void to torment me, but they were real. Pale, towering, unnaturally thin silhouettes, their proportions grotesquely elongated. They were motionless, as if frozen mid-step, yet I knew they were alive in some perverse way. They faced me, or perhaps they didn't have faces at all, only smooth, pale ovals where features should have been. My flashlight beams trembled as my arms weakened. My legs screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to run. I could feel the weight of their gaze, or what passed for gazes, boring into my chest. A high-pitched ringing filled my ears. Then, behind them, I saw a movement. Someone stood just beyond the line of these pale giants. Steve. His body was partially obscured, but I recognized the silhouette instantly. He was standing, unmoving, staring back at me. His eyes were wide, unfocused, mouth slightly open as though frozen mid-scream. "Steve!" I cried. The sound broke like glass against the crushing silence. One of the pale figures twitched at the sound. Not much, just a subtle tilt of the head, but it was enough. The others followed. Slowly, painfully, they all turned their headless faces toward me in unison. The ringing grew sharper. My body wanted to collapse under the pressure of that impossible gaze. Every primal instinct screamed inside me to drop my flashlights, close my eyes, and pray for unconsciousness. But Steve was still standing there. He hadn't moved. "Steve, can you hear me?" I shouted again, my voice barely audible beneath the rising hum inside my skull. No answer. The pale figures shifted again, their impossibly long arms twitching like broken marionettes. And then something new happened. From behind them, somewhere deeper in the endless corridor, came a soft dragging sound. A slow, wet scraping across the floor, deliberate and patient. I couldn't see what was coming, but the noise alone curdled my insides. Every part of my being screamed at me to break the rules, to sprint forward, to reach Steve before that thing reached him, but I couldn't move. I was trapped inside my own skin. The whispering returned, louder now. This time the words were clearer, though still layered and warped. The offering. Incomplete. The scraping sound grew louder. The pale figures took a synchronized step toward me. My knees buckled, but I stayed upright. Steve's mouth moved. At first, I thought it was imagination, but I saw it. His lips quivering, his jaw trembling against some invisible force. Then, finally, his voice cracked through the overwhelming noise. "Help me, Nate, please." And with those words, something shifted in me. I surged forward. The moment my foot crossed the invisible threshold toward the figures, they reacted violently. Their heads snapped backward, their arms stretched wide like broken wings, their movements spasming in unnatural spasms as though I had violated some ancient command. The dragging stopped. A guttural growl filled the void ahead, and for the first time, I saw it, only partially. Emerging from the darkness behind Steve, a mass of shifting flesh, tendrils writhing and coiling like serpents, countless gaping mouths with the entity. The source, the ritual's true master. The writhing mass behind Steve pulsed rhythmically, as if breathing. Tendrils slithered across the floor, some brushing gently against his ankles like curious fingers, others coiling upward toward his waist, testing, exploring. Its many mouths whispered in unison, the sound both wet and brittle, like hundreds of voices trapped underwater. Steve stood frozen. His eyes darted toward me, wide and glassy, shimmering with the faint reflection of my twin flashlights. His lips quivered again. "Nate, don't." The words came like a faint breeze, there but powerless against the growing pressure in the air. My pulse hammered in my throat. Every fiber of my being screamed for action, but my body remained shackled by terror. The pale figures still blocked my path, shifting slightly with every breath I took. Their skin, or what passed for it, was smooth and almost translucent, as though stretched over something hollow beneath. The absence of faces made their collective stare even worse. The dragging sound resumed behind them. The mass pulled itself closer. I could feel the vibrations through the floor now. Each heavy pull of the creature's weight shuddered up my legs and into my gut, making my stomach roil with nausea. The stench of old blood, rotting flesh, and something ancient, like earth long undisturbed, filled my nostrils. I glanced around desperately. My mind grasped for anything, any loophole in the ritual's rules, any forgotten piece of lore that might offer escape, but there were no answers, no hidden clauses to exploit. The ritual had not failed, it had evolved. I had triggered something deeper, something older than the rules themselves. The flashlight beams trembled as my arms weakened, sweat beading at my temples despite the cold. I tried to steady my breathing, to think through the panic. They hadn't attacked yet. They were waiting. Waiting for what? I remembered the instructions, leave behind an item of great personal value. I hadn't done that yet. I had brought nothing to offer, except, now I realized, perhaps the ritual had chosen Steve for me. My stomach clenched as the horrifying possibility surfaced. Steve was my offering. The thought nearly broke me. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." One of the pale figures tilted its head unnaturally, mimicking my words in eerie silence, like a puppet with broken strings. The mass writhed louder now. Its tendrils reached out again, one brushing gently across Steve's cheek. He flinched but didn't scream. Instead, a single tear rolled down his face. "You have to go," Steve croaked suddenly, louder this time. "Leave. You can't stop it." I shook my head, my throat closing around my breath. "I'm not leaving you." His gaze hardened for a moment, a flicker of the old Steve beneath the terror. "You already did." The words hit me like a gut punch. Guilt surged through my chest. He wasn't wrong. All those years chasing my brother's mystery, forcing Steve to follow me into these obsessions, always dragging him along into the darkness because I couldn't let go, because I was too afraid to face it alone. I took a single step forward. The pale figures responded immediately. Their elongated arms snapped outward like whips, creating a wall of thin, twitching limbs between me and Steve. Their bodies trembled, vibrating like strings pulled too tight. The mass behind them growled in approval, its many mouths opening wider, revealing layers of jagged teeth that didn't belong in any sane anatomy. I stopped moving. The ritual had boundaries. Violating them had triggered this, and now I was standing at the edge of something far worse than death. Behind me, the walls began to hum, a deep vibration that rattled the fixtures along the hallway, a low-pitched frequency that buzzed behind my teeth, sinking into my bones. The entire corridor seemed to be pulsing now, as though the building itself was alive, breathing in sync with the creature's movements. The mass hissed. Balance. The voices whispered in a dozen warped harmonies. Debt unpaid. I dropped to my knees, my strength buckling beneath the weight of those words. My fingers trembled, my skin cold to the touch. Every part of me screamed that this was my punishment, my failure. Steve's eyes remained locked on mine. "Nate," he whispered. "Please." I looked down at my wrist. My watch, the old timepiece passed down from my grandfather, ticked erratically, the second hand jerking like it was malfunctioning. It wasn't even keeping time anymore. It spun forward and backward in tiny, unnatural jolts. I thought of Daniel. The night he disappeared, he'd worn this very watch. He'd given it to me before leaving, as if passing on some unspoken burden, as if he knew. Maybe he had known. Was this why the ritual had chosen me now? Because Daniel had failed to complete it? Because the debt had been passed down to me? My grip tightened around the watch, my breathing shallow. I stood again, feeling the world spin slightly under my feet. "I'll offer myself," I said aloud. The pale figures froze. The creature behind Steve hissed, its tendrils recoiling slightly as if confused. I took another step forward, careful not to cross the invisible boundary. My voice shook, but I forced the words out. "Take me, let him go. I'm the one who started this." The tendrils paused midair, their writhing motions slowing. The air grew heavier as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. And then suddenly, laughter, soft at first, then building. 100 voices laughing in perfect disharmony. The sound rattled my skull, sending waves of nausea through my gut. One must offer, one must be taken. The creature's logic was not human. I couldn't bargain with it. This wasn't a transaction, it was a ritual. A machine that ran on sacrifice, on strict adherence to rules written by something incomprehensible. The mass surged forward suddenly, its tendrils whipping toward me. Instinctively, I stumbled backward, barely keeping my footing. The pale figures remained where they were, but something had shifted. The ritual had rejected my offer. It wanted Steve. Or worse, it already had him. A deep, guttural roar filled the corridor as the creature lunged forward, engulfing Steve's body in a cascade of flesh and shadow. "No!" I screamed, my voice hoarse, useless. His form disappeared beneath the writhing mass. The walls around me pulsed harder now, vibrating violently. The pale figures twitched, as if electrified, their arms jittering like puppet strings on fire. The ground beneath my feet cracked. The ritual was reaching its peak, and I was still trapped inside. The ground beneath me shuddered, as if some great unseen mechanism was churning inside the walls, groaning under the weight of its own ancient function. Dust rained down from cracks above, swirling through the thick, unnatural cold that clung to my skin like wet fabric. The creature was still devouring Steve, or maybe it already had. The mass twisted and undulated, tendrils snaking upward toward the ceiling, forming impossible arcs of flesh and shadow that seemed to defy gravity. Its mouths gaped and snapped rhythmically, each one hissing out words and voices I couldn't fully comprehend, words that didn't belong to any language. I stumbled backward, my chest heaving, my lungs searching for breath that wasn't there. The walls around me rippled again, bending inwards. My flashlights flickered and dimmed, barely illuminating more than a few feet ahead now. I was alone, truly, finally, utterly alone. The pale figures stood still, forming a wall of flesh between me and the abomination that had swallowed Steve. Their headless faces remained tilted toward me, as if acknowledging my helplessness. My mind spun wildly for some escape, some path out of this nightmare. But no rules applied here anymore. No loopholes, no safety. I wasn't even sure if I was still inside Markham Tower. The building felt, hollowed out, reshaped. This wasn't just a floor of an abandoned office complex. It was something older. Something buried inside the bones of the tower long before it was ever constructed. The ritual hadn't simply summoned an entity. It had revealed the truth of what this place had always been. A cage, a feeding chamber. I staggered down the corridor, not even sure where I was going, only knowing that staying still felt like waiting to die. Every step triggered faint echoes beneath my feet, as though the ground was thin and hollow, with entire caverns yawning just inches below the floorboards. The shadows watched me. They didn't move, but I could feel their collective gaze, suffocating, pressing into my back like 1,000 cold needles. I turned a corner, if it even was a corner, and stopped. Before me stood a door. Unlike the others, which had been old and ajar, this one was pristine. A heavy oak door with a brass handle that gleamed unnaturally under my failing light. Its surface was unmarked, untouched by time or decay, and carved into its center was a symbol I recognized instantly: circle, divided by 13 jagged lines radiating outward like twisted sunbeams. The sigil of the 13th Covenant, the cult. The one Daniel had mentioned years ago, back when his obsession with urban legends first began to spiral into something darker, something more dangerous. The same symbol I'd seen in the old forums, in the few police reports I had been able to uncover before they mysteriously disappeared from public record. My brother had found this place before me. He had tried the ritual, and now, so had I. My breath shook as I reached for the handle. The metal was cold, almost sticky, as if it recognized my touch. My fingers curled around it reluctantly, and with one slow exhale, I turned. The door opened without resistance. Beyond it was a room unlike anything I had seen in this nightmare so far. It was circular, with 13 pillars rising toward a ceiling lost in shadows. Between each pillar, blood-red cloth banners hung in tatters, swaying in a breeze that didn't exist. Strange symbols, similar to the one on the door, were etched into the stone walls, glowing faintly with a pulse that mimicked a slow heartbeat. In the center of the chamber stood an altar. It was simple, unadorned, except for the long, deep groove carved into its surface, where countless stains marked the flow of blood from previous offerings. On either side of the altar stood 2 more figures, but these were not like the pale watchers in the hallway. These were human, or had once been. Their skin was sunken and gray, stretched tight over brittle bones. Their hollow eyes stared straight ahead, lifeless, yet aware. They wore tattered ceremonial robes that bore the same sigil, embroidered in decaying gold thread across their chests. I knew immediately what they were: remnants. Failed participants of the ritual, now trapped as eternal witnesses to its cycles. The damned. A sharp breath escaped my lips as the weight of their gazes pressed into me. My flashlight faltered, and for a terrifying moment, the room was swallowed in black. When the light flickered back to life, the 2 figures had shifted. Their heads were now tilted slightly toward me, their mouths opening as if preparing to speak, but no words came. Only a long, gurgling exhale. I couldn't move. My legs locked beneath me. My fingers clenched the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Then came the whisper. Soft, intimate, not from them, but from somewhere behind me, from the mass. "You carry the blood." The voice slid into my ears like cold oil, spreading across my thoughts, wrapping around my mind with unnatural intimacy. The line must continue. My vision swam. The world tilted. Images flashed through my head, too fast, too chaotic. Daniel, the night he vanished, the old forums, the basement research sessions, The hours of obsessive reading, the stories he uncovered about Markham Tower, about the 13th Covenant, the rumors that the building was never meant to be an office tower at all, but a monument, a vessel, a prison. And then I saw him. Daniel, standing at this same altar years ago. Fear carved into his face, his lips moving, pleading to something unseen, and then darkness swallowing him whole. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't about me stumbling into something I didn't understand. This had always been about my family, about bloodlines, about debt. The ritual had waited for years, and now it had found its next participant. Me. I don't remember collapsing, but I was on my knees when I came to. The two figures still stood beside the altar, unmoving, their mouths slightly agape as if caught mid-sentence for eternity. My breath rasped in the stillness, chest heaving, cold sweat pooling at the base of my neck. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they had grown quieter, more intimate, like something had crawled inside my mind, speaking directly into the center of my skull. "You carry the blood." The words repeated themselves in slow, deliberate cadence, overlapping with a growing, rhythmic pulse in the room. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was something deeper, resonating through the marrow of my bones. I clutched the old watch at my wrist, my grandfather's watch, the one Daniel left for me. Its hands jittered erratically, spinning and reversing in twitching motions that no longer had any connection to time. The second hand stopped abruptly, landing on the number 13. It stayed there, vibrating softly as if aware. Everything was connected. The watch, Daniel, the tower, the ritual. I wasn't some random fool who stumbled into this nightmare. I was meant to be here. My family, my blood, had always been tied to this place. The 13th Covenant hadn't just lured victims from the outside. They had cultivated their own. Generations of offerings. The bloodline always fed the altar. I was always part of the debt. The realization burned through me, cutting deeper than any blade could. My mind reeled under the weight of it all. This wasn't about Steve. This wasn't even about Daniel anymore. This was about the continuation of something ancient. A machinery built on sacrifice. I staggered to my feet, legs weak but driven by a flickering surge of defiance. My eyes darted around the chamber, searching for any escape, but there was none. The room had no other doors, no hidden passages. The only exit had been the way I entered, now gone. The walls pulsed faintly with every breath I took, like living skin stretched over something massive beneath. The sigils glowed brighter now, responding to my movements, syncing with my heartbeat. And then, behind me, I heard it, a low, wet, dragging sound. The mass had followed. Its arrival was announced not with fury, but with patience, like a predator approaching its prey after having starved for far too long. The tendrils slithered into the room first, tasting the cold air, curling around the base of the stone pillars with calculated grace. I turned, my back pressing against the altar as the thing entered fully. It filled the entire entrance, a wall of undulating flesh, pulsating and folding over itself like a living tide. Multiple mouths whispered in unison, stretching open in slow, unnatural grins. The sounds they emitted weren't screams, nor words, but something between the two, something old. My knees buckled slightly. My fingers dug into the altar for support. "Why me?" I whispered hoarsely. The answer came not in words but images, flashes searing into my mind. I saw my grandfather standing before this same altar decades ago, his trembling hands gripping a ceremonial blade. I saw Daniel years later, led down this very hallway, his eyes wide with fear, but also, God help me, curiosity. And now I stood here, the chosen successor. One must offer, one must continue. The voices overlapped, hissing into my mind. "You took Steve," I rasped, struggling to stay upright. "Isn't that enough?" "Incomplete." The words slammed through my thoughts, louder than before. My stomach twisted. I felt the bile rise in my throat but forced it down. I was shaking violently now, not just from fear, but from the unbearable pressure pressing in from every side. The very air felt heavy, crushing. The tendrils reached closer, testing, curling around the altar's edge like curious fingers. I knew then with nauseating certainty that the ritual wasn't finished. Steve had been part of it, yes, but he was only a placeholder, a temporary balance. The true offering was always meant to be me, or worse. The ritual had been waiting for me to willingly submit. For the line to complete itself, it needed my acceptance. My submission would lock the cycle for another generation, another rotation of this sick machinery. And for the first time, I felt the pull. The strange, seductive invitation hiding beneath the horror. A cold comfort whispering that it could all end if I just surrendered. The voices shifted from demanding to promising. Peace, purpose, join. The temptation was grotesquely beautiful. All I had to do was step forward, let the mask consume me like it did Steve, like it did Daniel. I would become part of something larger, eternal. The suffering would stop, the fear would vanish. I took a step forward without realizing it. The creature surged slightly in response, tendrils widening as if to embrace me. My foot hovered above the ground. My body leaned forward, pulled by that magnetic promise of release. But then, something caught my eye. A glint on the altar. My grandfather's journal. The old leather-bound book, worn and fragile, the same journal I thought had been lost years ago after Daniel vanished. It was here. I snatched it instinctively, clutching it to my chest like a lifeline. My breath hitched as my eyes flicked across its first page, the familiar scrawl of my grandfather's handwriting staring back at me. The blood sustains the gate, but the gate may be sealed if the cycle is broken. Only the air may choose. My chest tightened, my vision blurred. The air. Me. I was not just the sacrifice, I was the key. The creature hissed sharply, the tendrils retracting slightly as if sensing the shift inside me. I flipped through the pages rapidly, my fingers trembling as I skimmed his desperate notes. His research, his warnings, he had known. He had tried to stop it. Break the line and the gate collapses. Deny the blood, deny the hunger. I looked up. The creature's many mouths writhed in agitation now. It could feel my resistance. The tendrils lashed against the stone floor, cracking tiles, the room pulsing faster, more violently. The two robed remnants flanking the altar twitched for the first time since I entered, their heads snapping toward me sharply, but they didn't move closer. They couldn't. The altar wasn't a place of surrender. It was a place of choice. And for the first time in my life, I had one. I clutched the journal tighter, planting my feet firmly. The pressure in my head screamed, the voices shrieking in protest, but I held. I won't continue this, I said through gritted teeth. The mass let out a deafening screech. The room trembled. The pillars groaned. The ritual was destabilizing. And I was still standing. The room convulsed, as if the very foundation beneath me were breathing in agony. The pillars groaned under the strain, the fabric banners whipping in invisible winds that clawed at my skin. The sigils along the walls pulsed violently, their crimson glow strobing faster, like a heartbeat spiraling into cardiac arrest. The mass screamed, not in rage, not in hunger, in fear. I had broken something. The weight of generations, of blood, of sacrifice was unraveling under my refusal. My legs threatened to buckle beneath the vibrations, but I forced myself to stand, gripping my grandfather's journal so tightly that my knuckles cracked under the strain. The pages whipped and tore from the gale, scattering his desperate notes into the swirling chaos, but I no longer needed them. The message was seared into my mind. Break the line and the gate collapses. The creature surged forward again, tendrils snapping outward like vipers, but they recoiled before reaching me. As if some rule still restrained it. The altar's edge formed an invisible boundary it could not cross. The very thing that had demanded sacrifice was now trapped by its own design. "You can't take me," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the shrieking vortex around me. "Not unless I offer myself." The pale remnants by the altar began to shake, their desiccated bodies rattling as if fighting against strings that had held them frozen for decades. One of them let out a dry, guttural gasp, a noise so human and yet so profoundly empty that it twisted my gut. The gate was destabilizing. The Covenant had never designed this place to allow for choice. They only built rules to sustain the machine. The rules were never to protect the participants. They were created to protect it. The entity didn't control the ritual. The Covenant did, and the Covenant was long dead. I took a slow step backward from the altar, keeping my eyes locked on the mass. The creature shifted and spasmed in protest, its bodies contorting, mouths snapping, tendrils thrashing like they were burning from the inside out. Behind me, faint cracks spiderwebbed across the stone walls. I could feel the very architecture of this unnatural chamber beginning to strain under the failing ritual. The air grew hotter, oppressive, like standing too close to an open furnace. The entity's whispers shifted tone, no longer commanding, but pleading. "You are the line. You are the key. Let us remain." I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying my breathing against the rising panic. I saw Daniel again, his terrified face from that night so many years ago when he stepped into this same room desperate to end his obsession. I saw Steve, his wide eyes as the mass had swallowed him whole. I saw my grandfather, hunched over these very pages, scribbling frantically in his final hours. They had all been dragged into this cycle, and I was the last link, but the rules had cracks, and cracks could be broken. The journal had made one thing painfully clear: only the heir may choose. The Covenant had constructed a failsafe, one final escape clause buried under generations of lies. If the bloodline refused to continue, the ritual would collapse. I stared at the mass, my voice steadier now. "I choose to end it." The response was immediate and deafening. The creature shrieked louder than before, its many mouths opening so wide that their forms ruptured, splitting along seams that oozed thick, black ichor. The tendrils whipped like frenzied serpents, colliding with the stone columns and shattering them into clouds of pulverized stone. The pale remnants fell forward, their brittle forms collapsing into heaps of bone and cloth, finally released from their unnatural bondage. The sigils on the walls burst into flashes of blinding light, their glow distorting into erratic patterns before flickering out entirely, leaving only pulsing veins of molten cracks across the chamber's surface. The entire room was falling apart, and yet I remained standing. The entity convulsed again, its mass folding inward upon itself, like a dying star collapsing under its own weight. The dragging sound of wet flesh grinding against itself filled the air, accompanied by a deep guttural howl that seemed to echo across dimensions. "We remain. We remain." The voices rasped, growing weaker. The cracks in the floor spread wider beneath my feet. Chunks of stone fell into a yawning abyss below, a void that looked like it had no bottom, no end. The ritual was collapsing space itself. The reality this chamber existed within was disintegrating, retreating into whatever unnatural place it had emerged from. I stumbled back as the floor beneath the altar crumbled completely, the entire structure falling into the abyss. The mass shrieked one final time, its enormous body dragged downward by an unseen force, as though gravity itself had finally remembered its hold over this abomination. The tendrils whipped toward me one last time, reaching, desperate, but they fell short. The mass vanished into the chasm. The air exploded outward in a shockwave, throwing me violently against one of the remaining pillars. My head snapped back. Darkness threatened to consume me entirely, but I held on, gripping consciousness by sheer will. When I opened my eyes again, silence greeted me. Not the oppressive, suffocating silence of before, but true emptiness. The chamber was almost entirely gone. The stone pillars were broken ruins. The walls were cracked open like brittle eggshells, exposing jagged fractures that led nowhere. just endless blackness beyond. And in the center of what remained, where the altar once stood, was only a flat circle of smooth stone. A seal. I dragged myself to my feet slowly, my body aching, my mind swimming from the shock. My breathing was shallow but steady. It was done. The ritual was broken. But even as I stood there in the aftermath, I knew something darker lingered beneath my brief relief, because as my flashlight beam swept over the far wall, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A door, new, perfect, untouched, and carved into its surface, etched with fresh, wet grooves, was the same sigil as before, 13 jagged lines radiating outward. Waiting. The new door shouldn't have been there, not after everything. But it was, smooth, pristine, untouched by the destruction that surrounded it, as if the collapse had carefully spared this one piece. The sigil carved into its surface looked fresh, almost wet, as though the stone itself had only moments ago bled it into existence. I couldn't move. For a long time, I simply stood there, breathing the thin, stale air that remained. The silence in this place had changed. It no longer felt oppressive. Now it was something worse. Expectant. I knew instinctively that behind that door the ritual continued. The gate was never truly closed, only delayed. The Covenant's design was more elaborate than I'd ever imagined. They had built fail-safes upon fail-safes. Even if one cycle was interrupted, another pathway would open, extending the ritual forward like an endless chain, so long as any fragment of the bloodline remained. And I was still breathing. My knees trembled under the weight of that realization. The victory I thought I'd won was nothing but an intermission. The machine had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. The hunger remained. The weight of generations bore down on me. My grandfather's desperate scribbles, Daniel's disappearance, Steve's sacrifice. All of it had only bought time. The Covenant hadn't cared who paid the price, only that someone would. And the more I stared at that door, the more a sickening truth gnawed at my brain. It wanted me to open it. That was its next rule. The heir must choose. I took one shaky step forward, feeling the ground shift slightly beneath my foot, as if even the floor itself were unsure whether it should still exist. As I approached, my breath fogged in the cold air. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but there was no exit behind me. The chamber had caved in completely, trapping me between a doorway to nowhere and the thing waiting beyond. The handle gleamed, a perfectly smooth brass knob, completely out of place in this rotting temple. I wasn't sure when my hand extended, but suddenly my palm hovered inches from the handle. The closer I got, the louder the voices returned, soft this time, like a gentle lullaby croning directly into my ear. All debts paid, all burdens lifted. Peace, Nathan, you were always meant to continue. My hand touched the cold brass. The metal pulsed under my fingertips, almost like a faint heartbeat. My vision blurred. For a moment, I wasn't in the chamber anymore. I stood in my childhood home, the living room where Daniel and I had once played. The walls were warm, sunlit, filled with laughter. My mother sat at the kitchen table, humming softly, flipping pages of a book. And there was Daniel, alive, smiling, his face unscarred by fear or ritual or obsession. He waved at me, beckoning me to sit beside him. "It's okay now," he said softly. "You can rest. You've done enough." The illusion was perfect. Too perfect. I clenched my jaw, feeling the bite of my molars grinding against each other. My fingers twitched against the doorknob. "No," I whispered. The image trembled. Daniel's smile faltered for the briefest second, his eyes flickering unnaturally like a corrupted video file. His voice layered strangely over itself, the pitch bending too sharp, too flat. "It's safe here," he continued, but there was a cold edge to the words now. "You deserve this. Don't fight anymore." The warmth in the room pulsed, then fractured. For a brief instant, I saw the truth leaking through the cracks of the illusion. The black void swirling beneath the false sky. the melted walls crawling with thin hair-like tendrils that whispered along the edges of my vision. The entity couldn't control me directly, but it could deceive. It was offering surrender disguised as comfort. I gritted my teeth harder, forcing my arm back from the door. "You won't take me that easily." The entire illusion shuddered, then shattered like broken glass falling into infinity. I was back inside the chamber again, standing before the door. My breath came in heavy gasps, my heart hammering inside my ribs. The voices shifted instantly, their tone no longer soft or coaxing. "You are ungrateful. The line must continue. You deny your purpose." The ground rumbled again beneath me. Cracks spiderwebbed further across what little floor remained. I stumbled, catching myself against the cold frame of the door. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath now a steady cloud of vapor, as the pressure in the air thickened. Somewhere deep behind the door, I heard the mass shifting, writhing again, waking. It was angry now. The Covenant's ancient machine was breaking, but it refused to die quietly. I scanned the chamber desperately. The altar was gone. The remnants were gone. Only this door and I remained. My grandfather's words pulsed in my memory. Deny the blood, deny the hunger. The watch on my wrist twitched again. The second hand still pointed defiantly to 13. The final rule was not submission, it was severance. If the line continued, the ritual would never end. It required me, not because of my willingness, but because of my existence. I stared at my trembling hand, at the watch that had linked me to this place for so long. The object passed from grandfather to brother to me, the item that symbolized the continuation of this cursed chain. Without it, there was no air. Without me, there was no ritual. I unstrapped the watch slowly, the brass cold against my fingertips. The entity hissed behind the door, its whispers warping into desperate shrieks. "No, do not break the seal. The gate demands you." I ignored the pleas. With the last of my strength, I lifted the watch and hurled it into the widening abyss behind me. The moment it left my hand, the entire chamber shook violently, as if the very reality around me resisted the act. The sigil on the door flashed bright crimson, then cracked. Thin fractures raced across its surface, splintering like fragile bone. The door groaned, the brass knob turning slowly on its own as the structure destabilized. The voices screamed now, dozens, howling in protest, like children being dragged away from a parent. "You were chosen. We remain." But they didn't. The door caved inward, folding into itself like paper ignited by invisible flame, collapsing into the void below. And then came the most terrifying sound of all. Silence. The ritual was over. The line was broken. I stood alone, breathing the empty air, surrounded by the crumbling remnants of something ancient that no longer held power over me. For now. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was hollow, like the absence left behind after something enormous had departed. A vacuum. The oppressive pressure that had loomed over me for what felt like hours, days, had vanished, leaving my ears ringing from the sudden emptiness. I stood there in the ruin of the chamber, surrounded by cracked stone and the fading pulse of dead sigils. My legs shook, both from exhaustion and the haunting realization that I had survived something not meant to be survived. The machine had collapsed, but it had not died cleanly. Its echoes still vibrated through the walls like the aftershocks of an earthquake. I turned slowly, searching for a way out. There was no clear exit. The doorway that had stood behind me was gone, swallowed into the fractures that now divided the floor. The void below still gaped, endless and black. And then I saw it. A narrow passageway previously hidden behind the original altar. The collapse had exposed it, like peeling back the skin of the tower itself to reveal its nervous system. The air that bled from it was colder than the chamber, a stagnant, untouched cold that smelled of dust, mildew, and something older. I didn't hesitate. There was nothing left to wait for. My flashlight beam cut through the narrow corridor as I stepped inside, ducking beneath low beams and pushing past heavy curtains of cobwebs that clung to my face and neck like dead fingers. The walls were lined with bricks blackened by time, their mortar crumbling at the edges. Ancient electrical wiring snaked along the ceiling, most of it frayed and long dead. This was not part of the tower's original design. This was older, predating Markham Tower entirely. The passage wound downward, deeper into the earth beneath the city. My boots scraped against worn stone steps, each one warped and uneven, as if countless feet had worn them down over generations. A terrible thought occurred to me as I descended. Markham Tower had never been built atop this place. It had been built around it. The 13th Covenant hadn't constructed the ritual here by accident. They had simply found the right soil for it to grow. I don't know how far I descended. Time had become meaningless in this place. My watch was gone, hurled into the abyss, severing what little grasp I had left on linear time. Finally, the staircase ended in another chamber. This one was different. The air was damp. The stone was rough-hewn, almost primitive, carved directly into the earth itself. Large stone slabs jutted from the walls, etched with more of the sigils, some of them even older than those above, their patterns more intricate, more deliberate. And at the center of the chamber stood a single stone pedestal. Resting atop it was a leather-bound book, intact, preserved as though untouched by the centuries. I approached carefully, half expecting some final trap, but nothing stirred. My flashlight beam illuminated the book's cover, revealing its title embossed in faded gold. The Founding of the 13th Covenant. I exhaled slowly, my breath misting in the frigid air. This was their genesis, their doctrine, the very foundation of everything that had pulled Daniel into its grip, that had claimed Steve, that had haunted my family for generations. My fingers trembled as I lifted the book. The leather felt dry, brittle beneath my touch. Dust spiraled into the beam of my flashlight as I opened it. The first page was handwritten, careful, ceremonial ink strokes. We, the founders of the 13th Covenant, do declare this sanctum beneath the soil of Black Hollow to be the vessel for that which waits beyond. The gate is hunger. The gate is balance. Through sacrifice we hold it at bay. Through blood we sustain it. My throat tightened. Black Hollow. That's where I was now. Not just Cleveland, not just Markham Tower. This was Black Hollow, the name long buried beneath real estate development and city expansion. A forgotten patch of earth whose history had been paved over, its origins deliberately erased. The Covenant hadn't simply worshipped the entity, they had imprisoned it. But at a price. I turned the pages faster, skimming through records of ritual cycles, diagrams of sacrificial altars, genealogies tracking bloodlines from Europe to America, anchoring the Covenant's heirs across generations. And then I found the list, a long, meticulous list of names. My grandfather, Daniel, and finally at the bottom, my own name, written decades before I was ever born. I staggered backward, nausea twisting my stomach. My entire life had been mapped before I ever existed. Every step, every obsession, every moment of curiosity, none of it had been random. It had been engineered. I was never a participant. I was bred for this. My breathing quickened, panic clawing at the edges of my sanity again. The walls seemed to press inward, the chamber shrinking. The cold wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, seeping into the marrow of my bones. The Covenant had ensured the ritual would always have a successor. If one heir resisted, another would be born. The cycle self-corrected. I wasn't chosen because I was special. I was chosen because I was inevitable. The whispers returned then, faint but insistent, curling from the shadows like smoke. Another will come. The line remains. You are not the end. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, but the voices were inside my skull. The truth I had uncovered wasn't salvation. Even breaking the ritual above had only slowed the machine. The foundation remained intact. This place was the root, the seed. If I left now, the Covenant's design would simply regrow around my absence. Another family, another child, another heir. unless I ended it here completely. I opened my eyes, my gaze landing on the crumbling stone around me, on the ancient sigils carved into every surface. These weren't merely ceremonial. They were functional wards, seals, prison bars holding the entity just beneath reality's skin. And like any prison, it could still be dismantled. The voices hissed louder, sensing my realization. Do not sever. The gate will open. All will be unmade. I didn't care. If destroying this place meant ending the cycle forever, then so be it. I began searching the chamber feverishly, looking for anything that could serve as kindling, as demolition, as spark. I would burn Black Hollow to the ground, and I would do it before another air ever breathed. The chamber seemed to pulse around me, as though sensing my intent. The air grew thicker, colder, every breath sharp against my throat like inhaling broken glass. The whispers had grown frantic, no longer steady or seductive, but chaotic, panicked. You will doom all. The balance must remain. The gate holds them back. I no longer listened. I had listened for far too long. My flashlight beam swung across the ancient stone as I frantically searched for any structural weakness, any point where this entire place could collapse. The chamber had stood untouched for centuries. It felt impossibly sturdy, as though built to outlive anything that dared to challenge it. But everything built by human hands breaks eventually. My eyes landed on the far wall. Deep cracks running vertically between the slabs. Fault lines. Stress points. Natural decay had already begun the work. I just needed to finish it. I dropped the book onto the ground and tore open my backpack. My fingers worked automatically, pulling free the small butane torch I always carried, a relic from my late-night explorations, once used to melt locks and solder old wiring. I sparked the flame to life. The flickering blue jet hissed and danced in my shaking hand. I scanned the wall again, looking for anything flammable. My gaze shifted to the aged wooden beams running along the top edges of the chamber. Support structures, added long after the original construction, likely when the Covenant expanded downward. Dry, brittle, waiting. I raised the torch. As the flame licked the edge of the lowest beam, the wood caught instantly, flaring with an angry crackle. The dry timber fed greedily on the fire, years of dust and decay igniting like kindling. Smoke billowed immediately, filling the tight space with choking heat. My lungs spasmed, my vision swimming behind stinging tears. The flames climbed higher, spreading along the interconnected beams, the wooden veins of this underground prison turning into a blazing skeleton. The voices screamed, "You are killing us! The gate will burst open. All will be devoured." The stone beneath my feet trembled, the floor beginning to shift unevenly as the temperature surged. Fissures widened along the cracked slabs, glowing faintly red from the heat trapped beneath. The ground was alive, and it was coming apart. I stumbled backward, coughing violently as the smoke grew thicker, black ribbons coiling through my beam of light. The fire reached the upper supports now, the heat distorting the air into shimmering waves. Chunks of mortar rained down from above. The chamber roared like a furnace. But through the growing inferno, I heard something else, something deeper beneath the screams of the voices. A moaning rumble, not from the walls, but from somewhere beneath them. The ground itself. The gate. The Covenant's final secret was unraveling, layer by layer. The prison they'd built not only fed the entity, but contained something far larger than the writhing mass I had seen. The rituals were never just about feeding. They were about containment. And now, the containment was failing. A section of the ceiling collapsed to my left, stone slabs shattering across the floor, barely missing me. I shielded my face as debris ricocheted in every direction. "Fool!" the voices howled in unison. "The gate kept worse things at bay. We were the guardians." Lies, or half-truths. The Covenant had never been protectors. They were parasites, feeding off the fear and blood of those they controlled, using the threat of something worse as leverage for obedience. But now that the machine was breaking, even the entity feared what might be unleashed in its absence. My chest heaved. The heat was unbearable now. The flames licked at the base of the pedestal, the book beginning to blacken and curl from the edges. I reached into my jacket and pulled free the last desperate tool I had. A small container of accelerant, meant originally to light damp fires during my hikes. I hurled it against the far wall. The liquid splattered across the stone like spilled oil. The flames reached it moments later. An explosion of fire surged outward, the heat wave knocking me off my feet and slamming me into the nearest wall. My head struck the stone hard, stars flashing behind my eyes. I tasted blood in my mouth. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My vision darkened at the edges, but the screams of the chamber pulled me back. The entire structure groaned now, twisting under its own collapse. The cracks beneath me glowed brighter, deep crimson veins of molten earth bleeding upward, forcing the ground apart like broken ice sheets. The gate was rising, and I was still trapped inside. My legs barely responded as I forced myself up, swaying under the weight of my own dizziness. The stairwell entrance, the path I had entered through, was gone, swallowed by falling debris. The only light now was the inferno devouring the chamber itself, casting everything in a pulsing red glow that seemed to breathe with each convulsion. I stumbled across the uneven stone, dodging falling chunks of ceiling, slipping on broken slabs, and choking on the thick, acrid smoke. The voices shrieked louder, no longer distinct, blending into a single, inhuman wail of despair. "You will open it! You cannot stop what comes. All your blood was for nothing." The final crack opened beneath the pedestal, swallowing it whole as the floor began to cave downward, widening into a spiraling pit of flame and void. I reached the far edge just as the collapse consumed most of the room. Only a narrow ledge remained. I pressed my back against the wall, clutching a small outcropping of stone for balance. The heat seared my skin, every breath a fight against burning lungs. Below me, something shifted inside the pit, a glimpse of something larger, deeper, a shape that made the writhing mass above seem small by comparison. Something primordial, something waiting. I stared into the abyss, my mind unraveling at the scale of it. The Covenant had lied to everyone, including themselves. They hadn't contained anything. They had barely slowed it. The flames roared higher as the last of the chamber broke apart. A final surge of collapsing stone tumbled into the pit, the resulting shockwave almost throwing me into the chasm. And then, the ledge cracked beneath my feet. The stone splintered, gravity pulled me sideways. I screamed as the world tilted, and then everything went black. I didn't know how long I was unconscious. When I finally opened my eyes, the world was different. There was no fire, no screams, no voices, no walls, only darkness. Not the suffocating, oppressive blackness I'd come to know in the ritual chambers, but something else, vast, open, as if I had fallen out of the world entirely, into a space beyond space. The ground beneath me felt like smooth stone, cold and perfectly flat. It reflected no light, no texture, only emptiness. And above me, nothing. No stars, no sky. I sat up slowly, my body aching as though crushed and rebuilt. My head throbbed, my skin burned, my lungs still tasted of smoke. But I was alive. Somehow, impossibly, I was still alive. I struggled to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me. The silence was absolute. Not even the sound of my own breathing echoed here. My flashlight was gone, lost during the collapse. My watch was long gone too. There was nothing left of what I had carried with me except the weight of the knowledge still anchored in my mind. The Covenant's work was destroyed, the ritual chamber collapsed, the prison broken, and yet, this place remained. Was this what they had feared? What they had desperately tried to contain with their endless sacrifices? A space outside the ritual, a void beneath reality. As I stood in the nothingness, I began to hear it. A faint pulse. Not a sound exactly. More like a vibration, low and rhythmic, deep beneath my feet. like a heartbeat buried inside the stone. Each throb sent a subtle ripple through the ground, radiating outward into the endless dark. I wasn't alone. Something was still here. I turned, trying to locate the source, but the darkness provided no bearings, no walls, no landmarks, no direction. Only that deep, slow pulse guiding me forward, like the steady beat of a drum echoing across an empty canyon. I walked. There was no sense of distance. Every step felt the same. My pace was slow at first, cautious, my ears straining for any shift in the pulse. But it remained steady, unchanging, leading me deeper into this hollow eternity. And then, finally, a shape appeared. It rose out of the darkness like a tower of bone, impossibly tall and thin. A single obelisk, its surface carved with symbols even older than those etched into the ritual chambers above. These weren't sigils of containment or worship. These were different. Older, forgotten. The language of whatever came before the covenant, the source. As I approached, I could see that the obelisk was cracked. Long fractures split its surface, leaking faint threads of red light from within. The pulse I had followed was coming from inside it, steady and alive. And at its base, resting on a small pedestal of black stone, was something I recognized instantly. My grandfather's journal, the one I had lost in the fire, perfectly intact, untouched by flame or time. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. This was no coincidence. The entity, whatever it was, had retrieved it, preserved it, presented it, not as a threat, as an invitation. The whispers returned, softer now, curling gently around me like tendrils of smoke. You carry the line. You bear the weight. The gate still weighed. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. No, I whispered. The ritual is broken. I ended it. The whispers paused, as if humoring me. You ended their ritual, not ours. The covenant served their purpose. They built the vessel, but they were never its true masters. You are closer to us now. My stomach twisted, my vision blurred with rage and exhaustion. I had fought so hard to destroy the Covenant's machine, only to find myself standing here, in the center of what they had been desperately trying to hold back. The entity had simply allowed the Covenant to exist, to serve its needs for a time. And now, with their system broken, it offered me something worse. Ascension. I stared at the journal again, my breath sharp. The whispers continued, more intimate now. You have seen beyond their rules. You know the truth. Join us, and you will never be afraid again. I shook my head violently, backing away from the pedestal. I won't. You will. The pulse beneath my feet quickened. The cracks in the obelisk spread wider. Thin streams of crimson light spiraling upward like veins. A low, guttural hum filled the air, vibrating through my chest. The air thickened, like invisible hands pressing against my skin from all sides. The line remains. The vessel was always meant to evolve. I dropped to my knees, the pressure overwhelming me, my thoughts splitting beneath the weight of something far larger than my mind could contain. I felt my own memories twisting, fracturing. Visions of my grandfather, of Daniel, of Steve, all distorted into grotesque echoes, their faces stretching, merging into one another. There was never a choice. There was only delay, but the gate is patient. Through the crushing haze, a flicker of my own voice screamed back. No, I slammed my fist into the stone beneath me, forcing myself upright, clinging to the last fragile thread of my own mind. I won't carry this forward, I gasped. If the line must end, then let it end with me. The whispers hissed sharply, like steam bursting from a fractured pipe. Then you choose nothing. You choose oblivion. So be it. The pulse stopped. The ground beneath my feet fractured violently, the stone splitting apart like shattered glass. Light burst upward from the abyss, searing and blinding. The obelisk screamed as it cracked completely down the middle, splitting apart as though the very fabric of reality was tearing. And then I fell again, into the light, into nothing. There was no sensation of falling, only descent. The world rushed past me without movement, as though gravity itself had lost meaning. The light around me dimmed, shifting into layers, colors that didn't exist in the spectrum I once knew. Shapes pulsed in the edges of my perception. Vast things, older than language, their forms too large to comprehend, as if they filled space not through size but through presence. I was not meant to see them, and yet they allowed me to. I felt their attention, not malevolence, not even hunger, but something worse, curiosity. The Covenant had always spoken of feeding the gate, of containing the hunger, but now I saw the greater truth behind their brittle religion. They had mistaken mercy for submission. These entities beyond the gate were not simply waiting to devour, they were indifferent. They only responded when summoned, when invoked, when something inside reality invited them forward. The ritual had not imprisoned them. It had served as a bridge, a point of invitation that kept the veil thin, and the Covenant sacrifices had acted like tapping on glass, like knocking on the edge of a sleeping thing, daring it to stir. The gate hadn't held them back. The gate had kept us barely beneath their attention, and now, the knocking had stopped. I fell deeper still, further from where time could follow me, and then I landed. Not with impact, but with stillness. One moment I was falling, the next I was simply standing, my feet planted on something solid but invisible. Ahead of me was a vast mirror. It stretched infinitely, a wall of polished surface reflecting not my face, but everything I was. Not a man, not an individual, but my entire line. My grandfather stood there, my brother, Steve. They were not themselves, but echoes trapped in the reflection, like insects frozen in amber. Their mouths moved, but no words came out. And behind them, thousands more. Every heir, every offering, every soul who had ever been pulled into this design, a lineage of puppets. The Covenant had never been the masters. They had merely offered generations into a cycle they barely understood, trading blood for borrowed stability. Now, with the Covenant gone, the ritual broken, the cycle dying, I was the last thread connecting them all. You see now, the voices whispered. Without the chain, they remain untethered. But so do you. The reflection flickered. My face began to dissolve in the glass, replaced by the swirling shadows of the others. Join them, it whispered. Complete what was started. I stumbled backward, my head pounding. The temptation was overwhelming. An end to the fight, to the terror, to dissolve into the collective and lose myself forever. And for a brief moment, I wanted it. The cold invitation was seductive, to cease existing as myself, to become nothing but memory. But in the pit of my chest, something resisted. Not defiant, not pride, but something older, deeper, my humanity. I was still alive, and so long as I was alive, I could still choose. No, I whispered. The mirror rippled violently as though struck by an unseen hand. You reject us. The whisper turned sharp, bitter. Then you will be alone. The figures of my grandfather, my brother, and Steve began to recede, pulled deeper into the glass, their faces stretching in silent agony. My heart shattered as I watched them disappear, knowing I could not reach them, could not save them, but neither would I join them. You choose exile. I stood my ground, my voice trembling but firm. I choose freedom. The world around me began to disintegrate. Cracks tore through the mirror like lightning across a midnight sky. The entire expanse of glass splintering into fragments that hung in the void like floating daggers. The vibrations beneath my feet surged as the structure of this place, this non-place, began to collapse entirely. You will carry the memory. The final words echoed inside my mind as everything broke apart. The void swallowed the fragments, the mirror, the ground, and then me. I woke gasping. Cold, clean air filled my lungs. Bright white light stung my eyes. It took several long minutes before my vision focused, the fluorescent ceiling tiles above me resolving into sharp rectangles. A heart monitor beeped softly to my left. My body was wrapped in wires, an IV dripping clear fluid into my arm. I was in a hospital, real. The nightmare was over. Or had it simply released me? Footsteps approached. A nurse, smiling gently, appeared at my bedside. "You're awake," she said softly, as though afraid to startle me. "Just rest. You've been through a lot." I tried to speak, but my throat was raw. I only managed a rasp. "How long?" "2 days," she replied. "Thank you for joining me on this chilling descent into the 13th floor." Behind every rule, every whisper, and every sacrifice lies the terrifying truth we often refuse to face: that some doors, once opened, never truly close. Nathan's fight may have ended, but the echoes of the gates still pulse quietly, waiting for the next knock. If you enjoyed this journey into darkness, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more horror stories that blur the line between reality and nightmare. And remember, not every invitation should be accepted, not every ritual should be completed, and some gates were never meant to be found. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.